Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's up, free range rabbits? We're back with another episode this week of Free the Rabbits, and I'm excited. We're going to talk about a very interesting cryptid called Pukwudgies, and that's spelled Pukwudgie, and they're a very interesting cryptid, and they're found in Delaware, Prince Edward Island in Canada, parts of Indiana and Massachusetts, and specifically a lot of modern ghost hunters and modern cryptozoologists will look for them in a place called the Bridgewater Triangle. And it is an area about 200 square miles within southeastern Massachusetts in the United States. And tons of stuff happens there. UFOs, poltergeist, Bigfoot sightings, giant snakes, thunderbirds, all kind of stuff's there. But one of the big things that's talked about specifically is these Pukwudgie type creatures. And I'm going to get into some of the fairy lore first before we get into the Pukwudgie lore. And then we'll talk about some modern stories of people having interactions with these Pukwudgies. But they have a lot of traits that are very similar to the fairies. And I thought it would be good to at least set some sort of fairy background to what I think these Pukwudgies could actually be. And I'm not going to do an entire episode on fairies because I do think if I was to decide to do that, that would be multiple episodes. But we are going to look at fairies at least somewhat today because I think the characteristics that have been talked about when it comes to fae folk, they bleed right into what these Pukwudgies are as well. Hey guys, thank you so much for being here on YouTube with myself and all the other free range rabbits. We have a brand new shirt we have added to our Free the Rabbits collection to commemorate this week's episode, our Pukwudgie Tube Soft Tees, available in all sizes and several color options. Also, for the people who have been asking on how they can donate to the show financially, we have several ways to do so. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/freetherabbits, where we have monthly memberships, or you can give a one-time donation. And also here on YouTube, we have memberships with different tiers, all of which have custom emojis you can use while on the channel. And if you can't donate financially, just you donating your time is the best gift possible to the show. And thank you so much for that. Keep sharing the show, everyone. Now, let's get back into it. Now, a fairy, also called the fae folk, fair folk. They are a type of mythical being or legendary creature. They are generally described as anthropomorphic. And anthropomorphic, for those who don't know what that word is, it is the attribution of human traits, emotions, or intentions to non-human entities. So they'll have very human-like characteristics, but they're not actually human. So this is what anthropomorphic means. For those that don't know what that word means, you know how I do on this show. I try to break down things that not everyone understands and just assume they understand. And I'm sure there's people right now like, I know what anthropomorphic means. Why are you stopping the episode? Well, it's for the people that don't. And to be honest with you, there's a lot that I don't know. And even as I'm researching, I find out stuff all the time. And I try to be cognizant of the fact that I know that not everyone knows everything. And I have to assume that when I present something, that a person has no clue what I'm talking about from the get-go. So I try to do that at least as much as possible. So fairies are found in the folklore of multiple European cultures. This is including the Celtics, the Slavics, Germanic, French folklore, and they are considered a form of spirit, often metaphysical. And I'm going to talk about how the Pukwudgies also have this metaphysical identity to them, supernatural and preternatural qualities. Now, myths and stories about fairies do not have a single origin, but are rather a collection of folk beliefs from disparate sources. And depending on who you talk to and what religions and what cultures, it depends on what they say about fairies, because some of them consider them to be good, others consider them to be evil. And generally speaking, either side will cast them as either demoted angels or demons, and that's generally in Christian tradition. And sometimes in pagan beliefs, they're considered deities. And in other beliefs, they're considered spirits of the dead, which I don't think is something that would go against a Christian belief either, depending on what they are. Some of them consider them to be prehistoric precursors to humanity, which would be these pre-Adamites. And this will tie into the hidden folk. And we'll talk briefly about them today too, because I think we could consider that these Pukwudgies could be in that realm, or at least some sort of offshoot of that tree. And fairies typically have some sort of human appearance. They look human. Some of them can shapeshift, and some of them are considered changelings. We'll talk about changelings a little bit today too. And they generally have magical powers, and they have this proclivity to be tricksters. And this is where we get the idea of the trickster demon a lot of times, and that ties into a Christian worldview. Now, when it comes to what I personally think about fairies and fae folk, I generally lend to the idea that they are trickster entities for the most part. Now, when we're talking about the hidden folk, or we're talking about some of these ancient versions of what these could be, I don't know. And I'll be honest with you, I still don't know if I know everything about fairies. Well, I can tell you I don't know a lot outside of research and my own interactions in the woods with seeing orbs dancing and songs and music coming from places that they shouldn't come. And I've seen some very interesting things on that front, which I would tie into the fae folk. Now, if you were going to ask me if I think that all fairies or fae folk are evil, I don't know. Because if we're going to consider that they are either products of some sort of interaction with fallen entities and something that's on our world that created them, or if it goes back to the hidden folk, if they were created by God, there's so many different avenues there. I don't have the answer to that. And I'm not going to sit there and tell you that, yes, verbatim, they're all evil. However, I can tell you that a lot of these trickster entities, these trickster fairies, generally don't have a human's best interest at heart. They may up front present that, but on the back end, there's some sort of pact or deal that's included with it. And that lends more to that demonic idea of them having those traits. But again, I'm not going to sit here and say, just like I'll never say that all Bigfoot, all dogmen, any other cryptid that's out there, that they're all Nephilim or they're all evil. I think that's a very narrow viewpoint. Also, I personally believe people that believe that aren't well researched enough to be able to say that that's a fact. Because if you are well researched enough, you'll know that there's so many different variations of these cryptids that we can't really just say, well, that's where they came from. We have no idea. Biblically, we have no idea. There's nothing biblically that states exactly what a Bigfoot is or exactly what a dogman is or any of these other things. Now, we can point to some scriptures and say, well, it looks like this is what they're talking about, right? There are some scriptures that it lends the idea that it might be talking about Bigfoot. But at the end of the day, there's nothing specific, and there's nothing specific that says that these things come from verbatim a negative source. Now, if you want to ask me where I think that some of these things might come from, then yeah, I'm sure that it lends to some sort of mixing of the seed of some sort of fallen angel with whatever, right? Not just humans, but whatever. So I think we have to hold that in a high regard. But even still, I've argued with my good Nephilim theory that everything has an opportunity to do what's right. So that would also leave fairies, if they come from that source, the opportunity to do what's right. So again, I also am going to say this, that I think that fairies are not just one thing. So we can't just narrow it down and say, this is it, because there's so many different versions of them. And there could be trickster entities playing like they are of the Fae genealogies, when in actuality they're not. And they're just some sort of demonic entity. And again, it's not a very easy thing to break down, but we're going to try to look at least some of the different variations today and culturally where the idea of fairies come from. And that's going to lead us right into Pukwudgies and some of the interesting stories that come out of these Native American tribes where they started. And I think it'll be very fascinating to look at, especially when we're looking at fairies of North America. And this being, in my opinion, one of the more interesting ones, and one that seems to still pop up when it comes to the modern era. And fairies can also encompass a lot of different cryptids and a lot of different magical creatures, such as goblins and gnomes, so many different ones. It'll just go under this umbrella of fae or fairies. So that's another thing you have to think about when you hear the word fairy. It doesn't mean exactly just one thing. It could mean so many different things. And goblins are small, grotesque, monstrous humanoid creatures that appear in the folklore of multiple European cultures. Some of the first stories came out of the Middle Ages, and these typically lend to this mischievous household spirits. And some of them are bestial thieves. They would steal horses and they would steal sheep. They would steal cows. And they can also shapeshift into different physical makeups. And they also have tons of magical abilities as well. So that's why goblins get thrown in the mix with fairies. But you'll notice a very interesting trait with most of these versions that come under the fairy umbrella is they can shapeshift. Now that, I think, when we see that they can do that, I do think that that does tie us into some sort of union with a fallen angel or fallen entity, because we do know that angels can also shapeshift. We know this biblically. So I believe that's where we get this idea of the hybrids. And these fae, or anything under the umbrella of fae, fall under this hybrid idea. Now, another one is the gnome, and it's a mythological creature, and it was introduced by Paracelsus. And if you don't know who Paracelsus is, and I'm going to give you his full name because I just love saying it, Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, and he was a Swiss physician, alchemist, lay theologian, and philosopher of the German Renaissance. He was a pioneer in several aspects of medical revolution, and this is where the idea of alchemy ties right into tons of different medical procedures and just pharmaceuticals in general. And he emphasized the value of observation in combination with received wisdom. Now, that received wisdom is important because the received wisdom to a alchemist like Paracelsus, which is also tied into a lot of Gnostic ideologies as well, he receives the download from something outside of himself, off-world intelligence, whether he believes it's angels or demons or just some sort of other entity. And he's got a lot of different entities he talks about in his writings, but this is what that received wisdom is. And he's credited as the father of toxicology, and he has a substantial influence as a prophet. And his prognostications were studied heavily by the Rosicrucians in the 17th century. And he is such a huge figure when it comes to a lot of these interesting alchemical ideas. And man, if I did anything on him, it would be like a 10-parter. It's just so much. And he's influenced so many different occultists and alchemists and just people in general. Modern medicine he influenced. And he really came to the forefront with the idea of gnomes. And he depicted them as small humanoids who live underground. And his version of the gnome was derived from the German miners' legends. And these trickster gnomes would play pranks on the miners. They would throw pebbles at them, but they also might reward them by showing them where a rich vein of silver might be and take them to gold or whatever else, right? This is why the idea of the gnomes tied into gold and silver and precious jewels because of these particular legends. And the one thing about Paracelsus that's interesting is the fact that he would talk in specifics about different types of metaphysical creatures and sometimes how to even create metaphysical creatures. Now, Paracelsus talks about his gnome was 2 spans, 18 inches in height, but also the gnomi, Gnomi, and it's a synonym of pygmy. He classifies them as earth elementals. And he says they are able to move through solid earth as easily as humans move through air. And he describes them as being like a spirit. So this ties back into the idea of the metaphysical, that they're not actually created here on earth. They're from a different realm, which I think that if we're at the root core of fairies and fae folk, I consider them to be some sort of elemental. They're from somewhere else. They're off world and they may shapeshift. They may look like a ton of different things, but I think at the root core that this is where we really get the idea from. And Paracelsus being one of the first people to come out and tied the gnomes into this, which also fairies are tied into this. I think this is more what I think that they are if they're not purely physical, right? I think they're more of this type. But he does say that the elementals do eat, drink, and talk like humans, and that's what distinguishes them from spirits. So they have this metaphysical / physical reality to them, and I think that may lend to the fact that they're from somewhere else, a different dimension, and they're able to move in and out of that dimension to this dimension. And he also talks about the dwarf too, which he considers to be another version of an earth spirit gnome. So very interesting that he brought that out. Now, I talked about how Paracelsus also talks about creating beings. And we're going to get briefly into what a homunculus is, because I do think that these created beings are also under this umbrella of fae or fae folks or fairies. Now, an homunculus is a small human being. This was popularized in the 16th century alchemy and 19th century fiction, and it's historically referred to the creation of a miniature full-formed human. And during medieval times and early modern times, it was thought that the homunculus was an artificial human-like being, and it was created through alchemy. Now, in alchemical writings attributed to Paracelsus, because this is kind of, again, where things start, is with Paracelsus. In 1493 to 1541, De Natura Rerum outlines his personal method for creating homunculi. And I've talked about homunculus on this show before. I've had Juan on from the One-on-One podcast, and that's one of his specialties, is talking about homunculus. But all these different alchemists had different ways of creating them. There wasn't one particular way. I have talked about Aleister Crowley had his own particular way that he talked about in Liber 367. So in Paracelsus' version, he says, and this is his words that were in his book, that the sperm of a man be putrefied by itself in a sealed cucurbit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb. So the sperm is sealed in a horse's womb, or at least so long that it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, which is easily observed. After this time, it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent without a body. If after this it is fed wisely with the arcanum of human blood and be nourished for up to 40 weeks and be kept in the even heat of the horse's womb, a living human child grows therefrom with all its members like another child, which is born of a woman, but much smaller. So he even talks about how it's an art form to create these miniature humans. And I find the idea of the homunculus fascinating. I also think it ties directly into cryptids and fae folk as well. And the idea, too, that the homunculus is given an spirit, a demonic spirit. I would even dare say these Nephilim spirits that are put into these homunculus bodies. So again, if we're looking at something very physical in the physical realm, we're going to talk about the Pukwudgies here. If we're talking about those beings in the physical realm and they have demonic entities attached to them, if we're looking at it from the homunculus angle, well, yeah, they could be a combination of metaphysical and physical in that sense as well. And to look further into the origins of fairies, we can look at them being a common feature of the Renaissance literature and Romantic art, and they were very popular in the UK during the Victorian and Edwardian eras, and the Celtic revival also saw fairies as a huge part of Celtic cultural heritage. And we talked during the Bloodlines of Jesus series about Celtic Christianity, and we know that's a form of Christianity that was common across the Celtic-speaking world during the early Middle Ages, but we also know it has a lot of ties to Gnosticism. And even though that the main idea is that they butted heads with the Roman Catholic Church, we do know from that series that they were also working with the Roman Catholic Church in a lot of ways, especially when it came to integrating a lot of this Gnostic ideology into both sides. But again, we're tying this into fairies, and it makes a lot of sense when we're looking at a very Gnostic form of Christianity that also integrates fairies into which is the Celtic revival. And it was a variety of movements and trends in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And it was a renewed interest in what people were looking to the Celtic culture. So artists and writers, they drew on all these different traditions, Gaelic traditions, Welsh, and they were painting a lot of these fairies, and fairies became a big part of the origins of Celtic culture. And we're going to talk definitely about the Tuatha De Danann a little bit today. And I know we talked about it during that Bloodlines of Jesus series, but when we're talking about fairy bloodlines, we're talking about fairies and fae folk and the origins of them. We have to talk about the Tuatha De Danann and some of these other offshoots of them, which we'll get into today. The English fairy word derives from the early modern English fairy, F-A-E-R-I-E. It means realm of the fays. Also, in Old French romance, a fae or fée was a woman skilled in magic and who knew the power and virtue of words, of stones, and of herbs. And this is where we get the idea that fairies aren't just these little pixies flying around, even though that they fall under the umbrella of fairies. But some fairies have been painted, have been talked about as looking very human. They were the size of humans. They operated like humans. They weren't just these small, short-statured beings, even though in a lot of iconography and a lot of fictional representations, that's what we see. But I can say that even in some more modern fictional depictions, that they are depicted as being more human-sized. Like you could look at Lord of the Rings, and we'll talk about a movie called The Watchers here in a minute, which I thought was a very interesting film that M. Night Shyamalan's daughter directed. Now, the term fairy is sometimes used to describe any magical creature, including goblins, gnomes, while at other times the term describes only a specific type of ethereal creature or sprite. So again, depending on what culture, what religion, what part of the world, all these things matter into what that group of people may say that fairies are. And that's why I say it's an umbrella term. It's not just one particular thing. And to get to some of the more human-looking like ones, we can go to Barthélemy de Herbelat, and he was a French Orientalist, and he was educated at the University of Paris, but he devoted himself to the study of Oriental languages. And he wrote the Bibliothèque Orientale, and he based it on an Arabic bibliography of Haji Khalfa. And Haji Khalfa was a Turkish polymath and author of the 17th century Ottoman Empire. So he basically did a deep dive breakdown on that manuscript. And part of him doing that, he talks about these fairies. Well, this particular type in Persian mythology, which are called Fairies, Peris, and they were angelic beings that were mentioned in antiquity in pre-Islamic Persia. And they were illustrated as fair-skinned, beautiful, and extravagant nature spirits that were supported by wings. So again, this umbrella term of fairies could mean a lot of things. Even these angelic beings could also be considered under this fae umbrella. And we're going to talk about principalities here in a minute and how that ties into elementals and why that we could also consider fallen angels to fall under this idea of fairies as well. As we get to the Middle Ages, though, fairy was used adjectively and it meant enchanted. But it also became a term for enchanted creatures, and a lot of other types of creatures like elves started falling under this umbrella as well. And as far as the descriptions go when it comes to fairies, they're described as human in appearance and they have magical powers. And depending again who you talk to, what culture, there's so many different sizes they could be. And some cultures would even say the smaller ones, like the sprites, could expand their figures to imitate humans. So they could shapeshift not just their size, but they could also grow in size too to then mimic humans. And that would be also a form of trickery and part of that trickster entity archetype. Now on Orkney, and Orkney is also known as the Orkney Islands, and it's an archipelago off the north coast of Maine, Scotland. And an archipelago is a grouping of islands, and this is a grouping of islands in Scotland, and you're going to find a lot of fairy talk in Scotland. Now, these fairies were described as short in stature, dressed in dark gray, and sometimes seen in armor. And in some folklore, these fairies have green eyes, and some of them wear footwear, and some of them are barefoot. Some of them have wings. Some of them are said to ride birds. But I find it interesting in Orkney in Scotland, they are dressed in dark gray. And this plays into the idea that the grays have been seen for a long time, but they just fall under this umbrella of fairies, fae folk. And it's even said that they have these ships that they would abduct people. This is in Scotland. And they would abduct them, sometimes bring them back, sometimes not. What does that sound like? Sounds like a lot of modern UFO abductions. And I think these things have been happening for a long time. I just think that they've been talked about in different ways. And I think fairies are just such a fascinating concept that so many things can fall under. And if we're going to look at Scotland, we got to look at Ireland too. And in Ireland, the mythic Aeshe, and this is spelled Aesidhe, Aeshe, or people of the fairy hills. And they have come to the modern meaning somewhat inclusive of fairies. So this is where people really point to when they want to talk about, hey, this is what the fairies actually are. And the Aeshe are a supernatural race in Gaelic folklore, and they're similar to elves, but check this out. They are said to descend from the Tuatha De Danann, or the gods of Irish mythology. And we talked about the Tuatha De Danann, and when we really track who the Tuatha De Danann were, I believe that they were giants. They were Nephilim, Raphaim. They come from these bloodlines. And this tied right into the Bloodlines of Jesus series that I did, and how that these Nephilim bloodlines integrated into these human bloodlines in Ireland. But what spawned out of it were, we talked about the Picts, and now we're also talking about the Aeshe. And the Aeshe were these folk of the Sidhe. And these are burial mounds in which they are said to dwell. And they are also seen as portals to the other world. And these Sidhe are fairy mounds, elf mounds, hollow hills. It's a place where humans interact with the gods, the spirits of nature, or the ancestors of old. And what does this remind you of? It should remind you of a lot of Native American lore and how they go to mounds to also interact with the gods. And it's said that in these mounds are what? Giant bones. So this isn't a new concept that just happened with the Native Americans. It also happened in Ireland. And I would dare say it's happened all across the world in different formats, but it's just written down differently and it's presented differently depending on what culture it is. But these fairies, whatever you want to call them, entities, have been around for a long time. Now, in some Christian circles, they believe that fairies were a class of demoted angels. So this lends the idea that fairies could also be fallen angels. Or in some groups, and we're going to talk about this particular story, there's one story that described a group of angels revolting, and God ordered the gates of heaven shut. Those still in heaven remain angels, those in hell became demons, and those caught in between became fairies. And then other people said that the angels that weren't godly enough but weren't evil enough were also considered fairies because they couldn't live in heaven and they couldn't live in hell. And I think if we really want to look at actual biblical writings, or if we look at the book of Enoch, we might throw those particular entities into the dead Nephilim space, this demonic entity space where they have no place to go. They're just roaming the earth looking for bodies to inhabit or to manipulate. And this is where the idea of these fairies, I think, in some format come from. I'm not saying all, though, because there's so many different versions of what these fairies could be. And get different versions in English Theosophist circles, and I've talked a lot about Theosophy on this show. In the 19th century, there was a belief within these circles that angelic nature of fairies was reported. So back to, they believed that these fairies were actually angels, and they referred to these entities as divas, D-E-V-A-S, which I also think that is one of the root words that slides into our term now for diva, D-I-V-A, which is the idea of a woman being a goddess. But if you know what this term actually means, it's getting down to the idea that these are angels. These are these gods, goddesses, and they're said to guide many processes of nature, such as evolution, growth of plants, and many reside in the sun. They're called solar angels. And then they've got these earthbound divas, which include nature spirits, elementals, fairies, and they're described to look more like humans, and they are of human size. So again, both of these versions are very human-like. So again, all fairies aren't these small sprites. Depending on who you're talking to, they could be a multitude of different things. Now, another interesting thing about these divas living inside the sun, which they say is the indwelling solar deity, of which the Theosophists call the solar logos. And the solar logos is, guess what, guys? A subject that we talk about a lot on this show. Ascended masters, also known as Mahatmas. And this also ties into these secret chiefs. These are these people who have ascended into these Gnostic levels. And I would dare say these entities are not people who have ascended to these Gnostic levels, but they are actual entities who are masquerading as people who've ascended to these Gnostic levels. But this is what they are. And this ties right into fairies. So we're looking in Theosophy as these ascended masters are also have a massive connection to these angelic beings and these fairies, and they all interact with us on a very visceral, sometimes earthly level. And we can't discount it that so many different cultures and different religions and all these different places around the world have talked about these beings, albeit they may call them different things, but they operate very much the same. The Irish also talk about these fairies as possibly being spirits of the dead, and the Sidhe, S-I-D-H-E, these burial mounds are said to house the bones of ancestors, and that these fairies are the spirits of those ancestors, and they're there to help the people that are there. I don't believe that in the slightest, and I think people on this show know what I think about anything saying that it is an ancestor that is here to help us. I would say a very super high percentage of that is negative entities that are masquerading. However, I'll leave a small percentage out there that God could allow a family member to come back to warn us about something. We know this is in the Bible, and we know that Samuel came to Saul, and we know that particular story happened. And if God wanted to allow that, he would. And I'm not going to leave that possibility out, but I will say most of the stories that I hear, especially in modern times, of people communing with the dead, you're not communing to the dead. You're talking to something that's masquerading. And this is what these Sidhe, at least in this particular format of Irish lore, talks about them being these ancestors of the dead, which I don't think that they were. I think that they were more than likely some sort of elemental spirit that's masquerading as that. Now, one of the theories of where the fairies actually came from, or the original origin of them, are called the hidden people. And this evolved from folk memories of a prehistoric race. And this is said to be newcomers superseded a body of earlier human or humanoid peoples. And the memories of this defeated race developed into modern conceptions of fairies. So there was a ton of underground rooms found in the Orkney Islands, which we talked about in the 19th century. And archaeologists uncovered this, and it lent to the idea that these were where the hidden folk lived, was underground, which we hear a lot of. And this is where the idea of cold iron was a charm against fairies, because it's viewed as a cultural memory of invaders with iron weapons, displacing people who had just stone, bone, and wood. So this is an idea that even ghost hunters go out today and do. And I know many people like myself know there's some weird connection between iron and scaring off fairies, and why that they're scared of them. And this is why it's because of this invading of maybe not just the hidden people, but just fairies in general, that they represent the woods, they represent nature. So when people came to conquer with iron, it scared them, or it freaks them out or angers them in a way, because of those weapons were able to drive them out of these particular areas. Another idea, and we talked about this already with Paracelsus, but we're going to bring it up again, is elementals. And this is the theory that fairies were an intelligent species. They were distinct from humans and angels, and they were magical entities, and they personified a particular force of nature, and they exert power over these forces. And many people in folklore call them spirits of the air. Ha ha ha. And I know if you're a Christian and you read the Bible, who is the prince of the air. And I also think this ties into Ephesians 6:11-13. I'm going to read these verses and I'm going to talk about why I think that these verses are tied into at least this version of fairies. Verse 11, put on the full armor of God so that you can make your stand against the devil's schemes. Verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the world's darkness, and against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Verse 13, therefore take up the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you will be able to stand your ground and having done everything to stand. And in verse 12, depending on the translation, the other word would be principalities. And this ties into these elementals and this idea that there are spirits of the air. And I find it fascinating that in so many different theories and different folklore traditions, they are looked at spirits of the air. As a matter of fact, Paracelsus, he classed gnomes and sylphs as elementals. So even he viewed these particular beings, these fairies, as elementals. And this is where you get the idea of like orbs that are seen, that are dancing around, that aren't just a flash of light, but are moving around, that those are fairies. And I've seen several of those on our trips while we're out in the woods. I've seen quite a few orbs. As a matter of fact, on one of the trips I went on, Tony and myself both saw a blue orb, and he saw it more than I did, but I saw it dance around. And I also heard some weird singing coming from the woods. It was like a small girl that was singing from the woods after I saw this blue orb disappear. And I would consider those to be these elemental fairies. That would be what I would classify them as. And I think if we're talking about shape-shifting, those elemental spirits, I think they may masquerade as other cryptids in the woods too. And that's why I say that I don't think that all cryptids are the same, even within a specific type of cryptid. I don't think they're all the same. It'd be impossible to say that they are when we're also dealing with this whole metaphysical part of it. And another one that falls under this umbrella would be changelings. And these are very interesting. And there's tons of lore about these type of fairies. And they're basically fairies left in the place of stolen humans. So it's the theme of child swapping. And you would hear this a lot in pre-industrial Europe. And there'd be a peasant family who had a child stolen, but it was replaced by a fairy child. And they wouldn't find this out until later, when this child would start acting differently and would start doing things that would not be considered human. I'm going to throw this out there too, that modern scholars have also argued that these stories of replaced children originated as folklore explanations for autism or other developmental conditions, which I do not throw that out either. Don't in the slightest. And you know how I feel in the show when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the conspiratorial community, mental health in any area, we have to look at those things. Because one thing I will never do is sit there and just take on the fantastical 100% 24/7. You cannot do that. As much as I believe in it and I completely believe in the supernatural world, I also know two things. People lie, and also people have mental instabilities, mental problems. It's a fact of life. And I have said a million times that the truth or conspiratorial world has a very high percentage of people who have mental health issues. And they're able to hide within these communities because they can say and tell these fantastical stories, and people will just immediately believe them without putting it through the rigors of, let me get to know what this person's actually saying. Let me get to know this person. And sometimes we don't have the ability to do that, right? And I do try to take on people's stories as truth initially, because I know that the weird exists. But I also know that there'll be a point, and the Bible talks about testing the spirits. That's also testing what information is given to you. And when I start doing that and I realize, oh, there's a lot of holes here. Oh, this person seems a little unstable, then I start looking at things a little differently. But I also don't shun them, because we don't need to do that either. Those people do need help. And I'm not saying that they're not afflicted by demonic entities or they're not seeing some of these things, because I think there's a high correlation between people with mental health issues and demonic entities preying on them. So I have to look at that aspect too. It's very complex. But to tie that back into this idea that there were people who had children that probably had mental health issues, and that was their way of explaining it away by saying that, oh, a fairy came and took my real kid, and this is just a bum version of what they gave us, some sort of fairy kid that was, messed up on the assembly line or something. I'm just being funny, but I could totally see that. I can see people in an era doing that. If they could tell other people this is what happened to explain away their child having issues, why wouldn't they? And to that point, in Irish legend, a fair child may appear sickly and will not grow in size like a normal child and may have notable physical characteristics such as a beard or long teeth. So they've got some weird physical characteristics. It even says they appear sickly. So yeah, we could throw some of them into the category of the kid just was handicapped in some way, and they would use the fairy stealing children to cover it up or explain it away. But it doesn't change the fact that some of this activity could really be going on with these changelings. And the fact that these fae folk were stealing children for whatever rituals and then putting some sort of fae child there, which the fae child would be considered a changeling and could change shape, change size. And this is where people would say their children would start doing some very strange things. And this plays into a movie called The Watchers. And The Watchers came out in 2024 of last year. It didn't get great ratings, by the way, just so you know, but I enjoyed it thoroughly. And I think I enjoyed it so much more because I understood the deeper context of what was going on here. And Ishana Night Shyamalan, this was her directorial debut, and M. Night Shyamalan helped produce it. And it follows Mina, who's played by Dakota Fanning, and she's a 28-year-old artist, and she becomes trapped in a vast untouched forest in the west of Ireland. So this all happens in Ireland too, and it's a lot of Irish fae lore that goes on in this. And I won't give away the plot or anything like that, but she gets trapped in the woods. She runs into some people who are also trapped in the woods, and they have to stay in this house, and they have to lock themselves in there at night. And there's this glass that they can't see out of, but the things out in the woods can see them. But if they go outside of it, then they'll get snatched up by these beings. And that's just kind of where I'm going to leave it, because it's got a lot of twists and turns and classic Shyamalan fashion. But it was very entertaining, and it ties directly into Nephilim lore big time. And there's even a creature with 6 fingers at one point where you're like, there it is. So if you get a chance, go check it out. I feel like that if you're into this type of stuff, you'll really like it. But I do think that people that wouldn't necessarily understand a lot of the deeper context and images that are going on and symbols that are going on in the movie might not like it as much, but I enjoyed it immensely. I'd say go check it out. But it ties right into this idea of hybrid offsprings and the fact that these changelings exist and they're able to interact with the human world and look human. So now we have got at least a nice foundation of different ideas of fairies. Obviously, we didn't go super deep because I do want to talk about these Pukwudgies. And Pukwudgie is a human-like creature of Wampanoag folklore, and they're found in Delaware, Prince Edward Island, which is an island province of Canada, and parts of Indiana and Massachusetts. And they're said to be 2 to 3 feet tall. So this plays right into what Paracelsus was saying as far as height goes when he was talking about gnomes, all these other different smaller versions of fairies. This falls right in with that category. And according to legend, Puckwudgies can appear and disappear at will, very metaphysical, shapeshift, The most common form is a creature that looks like a porcupine from the back and a half troll, half human from the front and walks upright, but they can shapeshift. So they can shapeshift into all kinds of different things, even human-like forms. So this plays right into the changeling aspect. This ties right into the fallen angel hybrid aspect. A lot of the ideas that come out of fairy culture is tied directly into these Pukwudgies. And they're known to lure people to their deaths, use magic, launch poison arrows, and create fire. So they've got a host of different magical abilities at their will. Now, the Native Americans believe that Pukwudgies were once friendly to humans, but then turned against them. And a lot of the Native American tribes will say it's best to leave them alone. But it also depends on the Native American tribe. And we're going to talk about specific tribes here in a minute and their idea of what the Pukwudgies did, what the Pukwudgies were. Because, again, the stories are very similar, but they vary. And sometimes the Pukwudgies are seen as more benevolent, but in most cases, they're seen pretty malevolent. So, and we'll get to why that they get so worked up and they want to attack humans. And in these Native American cultures, they consider the Pukwudgies to be the enemies of two of their cultural heroes, the giant Mashup and his wife, Granny Squanet. And I'm going to get into Granny Squanet and Mashup here in a minute, and I'll give you the origins of them, and I'll get you their connection to the Pukwudgies as well. And one story from Wampanoag folklore explains that they began causing mischief and tormenting the natives out of jealousy of the devotion and affection the natives had for Mashup, who's a giant, by the way. So this has got tons of Nephilim lore to it as well. And Mashup eventually exiled them to different parts of North America. And this is why that you have all these different stories of Pukwudgies all over North America, because the giant Mashup exiled them. And in some stories, he actually scooped them up and was just chunking them all over the place, which I thought was pretty funny too. And since then, they've been hostile to humans because the humans look to Mashup and his wife, Granny Squanet, who we'll talk about here in a second, as their gods, the ones that they worshipped. And the Pukwudgies didn't like it because, hey, we got magic too. Why are you messing with these creatures? And Granny Squanet is also a little person, so that could have had something to do with it as well. And actually, the Pukwudgies kill 5 of Mashup's sons, which are also giants. Some variations of the story say they killed Mashup himself. Some say that he left and went off. But at the end of the entire fable and lore of the Pukwudgies, Mashup is gone. He eventually just believes their lore. So this is the idea that they either killed him or he left because he was so grieved because his 5 sons had been killed by these Pukwudgies. And the Pukwudgies are predominantly involved with the Wampanoag tribe and the Lenape tribe as well. And the Wampanoag tribe are a Native American people of the northeastern woodlands, currently based in southeastern Massachusetts and formerly parts of eastern Rhode Island. Their historical territory includes the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, just so you know where the Wampanoag are centralized. The Lenape tribe are indigenous people of northeastern woodlands as well, and they live in the United States and Canada. And you can find them in Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Lehigh Valley, New York Bay, Long Island, New York State. Some of their communities now are Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Ontario. So you'll find them in a lot of the same areas that you'll find the Wampanoag tribe. And this is where most of the Pukwudgie lore comes from. Now, the Algonquin tribe, which is also connected to these 2 tribes I just named, and they were widespread through North America, and they were consisting of the peoples who speak the Algonquin languages, which, by the way, some of these other tribes that we'll be mentioning have offshoot languages of the Algonquin languages as well. But you'll also hear many tales coming out of the Algonquin tribe about this particular creature, the Pukwudgie, and in their language, Pukwudgie translates to little man of the woods that vanishes. So it lends the idea that these are little creatures who are metaphysical that can shapeshift and they can hide basically within a separate reality from ours. So the tales of the Pukwudgie actually go back as far as 9,000 years ago. So this lends to what we talked about before with the hidden people being of this early race of humans. So the further we go back, the more we start looking at these connections between even these Pukwudgies, who are in this umbrella term of Fae, leading back to the hidden people and an early race of humans. And it was around this particular time that the Wampanoag told the first story of this mysterious entity. And their account, early account, said that they once lived in harmony with humans, but they eventually turned on us. And many different ideas why, and we're going to get into that in a minute when we talk about Mashup and Granny Squanet. But there's so many different variations of that we have to look at all of the different tribes and what they're pushing when it comes to this particular story of these Pukwudgies. We've got the Abenaki tribe, and they are an Algonquin-speaking people and part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. And they are predominantly in Maine. You also see them in Quebec, Vermont, New Hampshire. And according to their lore, the Pukwudgie are generally harmless beings. So to them, they didn't think the Pukwudgies were what these other tribes are saying. But they did say that they were considered to be tricksters, and they are thought to only bring harm to those who mistreat or disrespect them. They're known to play pranks, and they may lead people into the forest so they get lost. Not that they're actually trying to kill them or off them. They're just trickster entities. But this also leads into this elemental idea of the trickster entity and trying to play with the minds of humans. So to get into the giant Mashup and his wife, Granny Squanet, they are two mythological beings from the Wampanoag and Mohegan tribes of New England. And Mashup, the giant, represents the large and great beings to these tribes. And to maintain the balance of him being this massive giant, this Nephilim, he marries Granny Squanet, and she was the leader of the magical woodland little people. This giant who marries this little bitty little person who is super magical. And we'll talk about how magical she was in a minute. So there's one story that talks about Mashup was trying to build a bridge between Martha's Vineyard and the mainland, and this crab hits his toe, and he freaks out, and it causes him to leave footprints all over the area. And in some versions, he gets so irritated that he turns red, and he just starts stomping footprints all about. And he starts throwing stones all over Connecticut too. And that explains why the landscape's so rocky, because he's throwing rocks. And it's possible, man. If the giant's that big, he could be. But it also ties into Mashup's rock. And Mashup's rock is one of the footprints left by Mashup the giant. And it's also known as the devil's footprint by Christians when they came into the area and they saw it. And it's a sacred site for the Mohegan tribe located in the Mohegan homeland, specifically at Mohegan Hill in Uncasville, Connecticut. And if you're on YouTube or Rumble, you'll see the picture of this petrified footprint, which is crazy looking. And it's huge. Was it from an actual giant? We don't know for sure, but we know of plenty of handprints and footprints all around the world that are petrified. We even know of what looks to be petrified giants in some places too, I would dare say. Petrified giant trees, which lends to the idea that in an earlier version of the earth that things were a lot bigger. And that's a whole different story when we get into old earth. But if we're just talking about giants in general, and we can even say pre-deluge, we don't have to go that far back, then yeah, some of these giants could have been petrified. There were footprints petrified. We know of dinosaur footprints being petrified just even in the US. So to think that it's not a giant's footprint would be silly of us to say. But also we don't know for sure. This is the idea that Mashup, this giant, who was revered by all these different Native American tribes, who was the bane of the existence of these Pukwudgies, he got attacked by a crab and he stomped this footprint because he was angry. And Mashup was said to have several companions. He actually had a giant frog that was one of his companions, and obviously his wife, Granny Squanet. And his diet actually consisted of whales. Some people think that he actually turned into a whale and left, and that was part of why he left when his sons died. Again, different versions of the story throughout, but he was said to eat whales, and to catch them, he actually threw boulders into the water to make stepping stones so he could get out there far enough to grab them, which is super crazy too. And he's also seen as provider for the Wampanoag, and he taught them how to hunt, how to fish. What does that sound like? That sounds the classic tale of the god teaching the humans how to advance themselves. But there's a point where the Wampanoag actually say that they felt like they were becoming too reliant on him. So they actually left so they could learn to survive on their own. So another story of how Mashup leaves their actual tales. Now, Granny Squanet is a mythical figure from Wampanoag folklore, and she's the wife of Giant, and she can either be seen as a small woodland or sea creature. So again, depending on the lore, she also could have come from the sea. Now, she's known as one of the Pukwudgies, and the Pukwudgies are said to be good spirits, and the Mohegans know they got to be treated with respect, and they will leave them baskets of food, corn cakes, berries, meat in the woods for them. And the Pukwudgies are said to wear moccasin flowers for shoes, and the word Pukwudgie means whippoorwill moccasins. And there's a reason for that, because when the Pukwudgie or little people show up after nightfall at the call of the whippoorwill bird, and it signals their arrival at night. So this is why that Pukwudgie is named after whippoorwill moccasins. And they have their own rules of etiquette. You're not supposed to look directly at them. They think it's rude. If they catch you staring, they might point a finger at you and they'll root you to the ground and take all your belongings. You're not supposed to speak to them during the summer when they're most active. But what they will do in return for kindness, they did what? They taught the Mohegan people how to grow corn, use healing plants, help keep the earth well. They'll grant favors to them. This is a tale as old as time. Creatures who are more powerful than humans, helping them advance. So in that aspect, we really got to look at even what Granny Squanet is as being one of these fallen entities or a derivative of them, because they are helping humans to advance. But they also have a mean streak. They always seem to have some sort of mean streak. If you don't do what we want you to do, we might kill you and take everything you got. There's a really interesting story about Granny Squanet, and this starts when English settlers come and they start disrupting the ways of the Mohegan. So as a result, they forget to ask the Pukwudgie for help. And because of that, the Mohegans and the Pukwudgie fall ill. So this is a time of bad spirits. And there was a medicine woman living with the Mohegans. And one night during a terrible storm, she hears the whippoorwill. And she looks outside, the bird's not there. But there's a small boy that's standing in the rain on her doorstep. But he was actually a grown Pukwudgie. His name was Wiegand. And he told her to come help that someone was sick. So the storm's fierce. He leads her through the forest. He gets her to a place where they just start descending into the ground. And Wiegand leads her to a beehive-shaped chamber of rocks. And inside there's an old lady. She's very ill, very sick. And the Pukwudgie tells the medicine woman that's down there that this is actually Granny Squanet, and she's got to be made well. She's very powerful. She's known to cause storms. Even when she argues with her giant husband, which I think was pretty funny too. But she's help. She's healing. So the medicine woman treats her for nearly a moon, and then she gets better. And for restoring Granny Squanet's health, the Pukwudgie gave the medicine woman gifts and told her to remember them. And then they actually blindfold her and send her back home, which is like the precursor to, what the CIA might do if they drag somebody somewhere to interrogate them, or what a mobster might do, or a mafia member might do when they bring you to a undisclosed place. They don't want you to know how to get there. They just put that bag over your head and drive you out there, pull it off, and ask you a bunch of questions, put it back on. It's exactly what happened to this medicine woman. They blindfolded her, took her back home. You'll never know how to get back here. But it's an interesting story. Now, to get a little deeper into the stories of Mashup and Granny Squanet, we have to look at Roger Williams. And Roger Williams, he was born in 1603, and he died in March of 1683. And he was an English-born New England minister, theologian, author, and founder of Providence Plantations, which became the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, and later the state of Rhode Island. So he basically started the state of Rhode Island. And he was an advocate for religious liberty, separation of church and state, and fair dealings with the Native Americans. And he started out as a Puritan minister, but he eventually became a Baptist minister, and he founded the first Baptist church in America as well. But he's important because he wrote a lot about the Native Americans. As a matter of fact, he was very connected to the Native Americans. And he talks about the Narragansett tribe, and they're an Algonquin American Indian tribe from Rhode Island. So he had a lot of interactions with them. And he talks about their stories and how they revered 37 different gods. And he writes about all these different 37 gods. And he talks about one of them, particularly Mashup, a giant who created Nantucket and other geographical features. So this giant actually created a lot of these different geographical features. Now, his wife, Squanet, is also acknowledged by the Wampanoag and the Mohegan and the Narragansett tribe. And Williams talks about that Squanet and Mashup had a troubled marriage. He said Mashup had a temper that matched his huge height and once threw all their children into the sea where they were transformed into whales. It's a very interesting tale. This giant getting mad at his own kids and tossing them into the sea. So Squanet was upset about this and mourned the loss of her children. Her tears enraged Mashup more, and he threw her from their home on Martha's Vineyard to Rhode Island, and she was transformed into Squanet Rock. And Squanet Rock originally was shaped like a woman, but over time its limbs fell off and it became unrecognizable. So when people look at that rock now, they say that it was the petrified form of Squanet. Now, another interesting story about Squanet was that she was actually very beautiful, but her eyes were cut into square shapes by an enemy who found her asleep on the beach. And she hid her deformity by growing out her long black hair to the point that it grew out all the way to her ankles and it covers her whole body. It makes me kind of think about some of the trolls that we talked about during the troll episode that are seen, that are super hairy, that have hair that just grows all the way from their head all the way down. It covers most of their body. Maybe think about that a little bit with this story. Now, the other part of that is that she's still very active in the world and isn't just petrified down on the Rhode Island shore. So even now, it's said in more modern times that she's very active and that she's not just petrified down there, that that's just part of the tale that this rock was pointed out and said, oh, that's her. So here's a story from 1928. There's a group of school children and their teacher. And they're walking along the beach near Mashpee. And as they're walking, they saw what they think was a hay cart being pulled by oxen. But they realized they weren't oxen. The giant pile of hay was moving itself. It was Granny Squanet. So they all freak out in fear. Mashpee children were instructed to never make fun of Squanet or she would tear you all to pieces. And during the annual Cranberry Festival in the 20th century, a child was given a basket of food to carry into the dunes to set down at a lonely spot as a gift to old Granny Squanet and cautioned to hurry away without ever looking back. So those are more modern stories, early 1900s, but modern stories of people actually seeing what this creature was. Now, was it Granny Squanet, the Granny Squanet? I don't know. If it was actually something, it could be something troll-like. I would consider it more in that category, or maybe it's a derivative of whatever creature Squanet actually was. But very interesting stuff that this has been reported in history of people seeing these creatures, and not just from the Native Americans, but from many Europeans that came over here as well. So back to the Pukwudgies, because we talked about the lore of who they attacked. Well, Pukwudgies have features that resemble those of human, but they have enlarged noses, fingers, and ears, and their skin is described as being a smooth gray. and at times has been known to glow. So that made me think about the Greys again. Why are the Greys always intertwined with these small creatures? Are these creatures some sort of hybrid off of what these Greys are? Are the Greys some sort of hybrid off of whatever the original source is? I would argue that all of these possibilities are on the table, but I find it interesting that a lot of these fairies and fae and now Pukwudgies have gray skin or gray clothes, and they all seem to have these little bodies, big heads. It just seems to me like they're coming from the same source. And if you argue with me against it, I couldn't say you're wrong because I don't have the answer, but I'm just looking at what all of these different stories and the different lores that all these different Native American tribes and Europeans have talked about. And it seems to be that they have at least somewhat similar makeup. Pukwudgies are actually said to control, and this will be very interesting too, Tepehuancas. And these Tepehuancas are believed to be the souls of Native Americans they've killed. So they're apparently controlling souls, which I think's another layer. And I'm not saying they're actually controlling the souls of Native Americans, but what are these souls? What are these spirits, the entities that they're saying they're souls, right? What are they actually controlling? Are these Nephilim spirits? Are these demonic spirits that they're controlling? Are they connected directly to the Pukwudgies? Are the Pukwudgies inhabited by these demonic spirits? Are they something different, but these demonic spirits are just rolling with the Pukwudgies? It's interesting, but that part to me really stood out with that they're controlling the souls of Native Americans. And to get a little deeper into the Mashup Granny Squanet story, but then we're going to look at it from the Pukwudgie eye lens. So it said they became mischievous and aggravated that the natives were asking Granny Squanet, Mashup's wife, for help, for healing. And they also would essentially worship Mashup because he was teaching them how to hunt, teaching them how to grow corn and all kinds of other types of plant life. And Mashup actually collects a bunch of these Pukwudgies, and I spoke about this earlier, and he shakes them till they're confused, and he tosses them around New England. Now, some of them died, some of them landed and regained their minds and started making their way back to Massachusetts. They're mad now. So Mashup is satisfied. He's done his job. He pleased his wife. So he actually goes away for a while. But when he's gone, the Pukwudgies return, and now they are not happy. They are angry. So their relationship with the Wampanoags are way different now because they used to just be tricksters and they would try to trick them and play tricks on them. Now they're not a nuisance. They start kidnapping their children. So this lends back to the fairy idea of the children being stolen. So this is why we put the Pukwudgies in this fairy umbrella. And they start burning villages. They start forcing the Wampanoag deep into the woods, and they start killing them there too. So Squanet steps in. Mashup won't because he's being lazy at this point. So he sends his 5 sons to fix the problem. So the Pukwudgies, they're super smart. They've already dealt with Mashup once, and Mashup shook them up like some dice and just rolled them all over Massachusetts. So the Pukwudgies, they've learned a lesson. So they lure these 5 sons into the deep grass and they shoot them dead with magic arrows. Squanet is pissed. So she hits up Mashup and they attack as many as they could find and crush them. But a lot of them escape and scatter through New England again. So this is why they're still appearing now in our current era. And as a matter of fact, one of the places that they are appearing a lot are the Bridgewater Triangle, which I talked about, but many other areas as well. But if you want to go find them, and I wouldn't suggest you go alone to go find these, but Bridgewater Triangle is where they're said to be seen, or you can hear their chatter like they're talking to you. But yeah, they're scattered off through New England. So they actually regroup again. These guys don't stop. They're mad. And they trick Mashup into the water and they shoot him with arrows. Now, some legends say that he died, and others claim he just became discouraged and depressed. His sons died, and he just leaves. And this is when Mashup disappears from the Wampanoag's mythology. He's gone at this point. So this is where we get the idea that the Pukwudgies actually won. And however you want to look at it, they did win, because whether he actually died or he left, they got him to leave. These guys don't stop. That's the thing about Pukwudgies, man. They are relentless little troll fairy creatures. And they're no strangers to pop culture either. As a matter of fact, they appear as a part of J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World Fantasy Universe via the Pottermore website. So this is Harry Potter. Also, they're actually mentioned in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. So Pukwudgies are also bogarted into the Harry Potter world as well for the average mainstream audience. They're also talked about in the Encyclopedia of Fairies and World Folklore and Mythology by Theresa Bain. And she's the author of nearly a dozen historical nonfiction reference encyclopedias on demons, fairies, ghosts, giants, monsters, mythological places, objects, the like. She's from Virginia, and she wrote a very extensive book, this Encyclopedia of Fairies, and she talks about these different types of pucks and Pukwudgies, and she talks about the puck, which originally the word puck was used to refer to all of fairy kind. Eventually, it referred to a specific nature spirit called Puck, an impish trickster in pre-Christianized Europe. And the most familiar use of this name was a character in William Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in the play, the merry and mischievous Puck of medieval English folklore boasts of pranks, shape-shifting abilities, and very fairy-like behavior. And they're said to dance on the moonlight as well. So that's our first puck, which is the first part of Pukwudgie. But then we've got another puck, P-U-K, because the first one was P-U-C-K. And in Friesland, the puck is a very similar to the kobold of German fairy lore. It's described as wearing a long green or gray jacket, a pointed red cap, and slippers on its feet. When it's treated well, it will do all of these chores and tend to cattle. If they're not happy, they will become a trickster and start pulling pranks on you, and even worse. So typical fairy behavior. We've got the Pukwudgies, P-U-K-I-S, and it is a household fairy, and it's described as being a goblin and having the appearance of a dragon. It's said to be a trickster, a treasure hoarding fairy, said to have the ability to shapeshift into a cat or rooster while standing on the ground, or a dragon with a fiery tail while in the air. So this is a little bit different in physical makeup, but it still comes from a very similar root word for puck. We got Puckus, and she does talk about the Pukwudgies, which comes in right after that. And she says that they are an elusive, small, and troll-like, and have the ability to appear and disappear at will, shapeshift into animals. So she goes a little bit deeper into what they can shapeshift into. So they can masquerade as all kind of animals in the woods, and they possess magical arrows that can create fire at will. They have control over the teapot wonkus, the spirits of the people they killed, which we talked about too. And she says they only stand no more than 3 feet, and they have facial features similar to the Wampanoag people. However, their ears, fingers, and noses are greatly enlarged, and their skin is gray and smooth. She says they're malicious nature spirits, and they're known to lure people to cliffs and then push them off. This is the idea that fairies lure you into the woods and take you to a dangerous place. So these Pukwudgie, in all cases, except for a few stories, which we talked about, considered to be very malevolent and evil in a lot of cases. Now I'm going to get into a couple modern stories that I was able to run across. Very interesting as well. And we're going to start with Peter Muse. And he's the author of Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts and Legends and Lore of the North Shore. And he's talked a lot about magical folk and magical creatures, written books about them. But he runs a blog on his website, and he gets emails and stories from people. And so he tells about these 2 encounters with Pukwudgies in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Now, he won't give away the real name of the person, but he calls her Miss S. And he talks about the first incident happened when Miss S's brother, Bob, was a child, and he was 7 or 8 years old, was watching TV with some cousins, at their grandparents' house in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Sitting on the couch, they're facing the TV, and Bob, in particular's back was towards the doorway into another room, and he felt someone pull the back of his hair, and he thought it was his cousin Sandra, and he told her to stop. Sandra said she wasn't doing it. A few seconds later, he felt it again. He yelled at his cousin, who said she didn't do it, and then again it happens. So he turns around angrily, and he expected to see one of his cousins hiding behind the couch, but he is blown away by what he sees. He sees a little old lady with long white hair. We're talking about 3 foot. And when she sees Bob looking at her, she quickly freaks out, runs towards the front door, and then she disappears into thin air before she reaches it. So she didn't even go through it, literally go through it or open it and go through it. She just disappears before she even gets to it. So he's freaked out. He yells to his grandmother about it. She responds with, "Don't worry, they're friendly." Interesting. So she's seen them. So this is definitely Pukwudgie territory. Now, the second incident occurs another day, and Bob's mother takes him and his cousins, including Sandra, to the movies. Now, when the movie goes over, they return to their grandparents' house. The door was locked. No one's supposed to be home. So they're surprised when they get to the window. There's a lamp that's on in the living room. So Sandra peers through the window to see if she can see the grandparents, and she jumps back from the window and screams she's getting out of there, right? So Bob's mother steps out the window and looks inside, and she sees a very short old man with long white hair run out of the living room. She grabs the kids and she leaves. So he's in the same 2 to 3 foot range as well. And looking back on it, Miss S says that her brother and mother still talk about those incidents. And then they also say in retrospect, there was a lot of odd stuff happening. They would find like a tin of coffee open. They'd find stuff spilled on the floor, bottles of Coke stored in the attic, open and half drunk. They would see all these things and they just attributed it to some sort of animal. And then after these incidences, they realized, oh, this is these creatures that we saw. What's interesting is she started looking into what it could be and ran across the Pukwudgies, and she saw different drawings of them. And she said, that's exactly what I saw, what was coming out of the local Algonquin lore. These are the things that I saw. And to even tie this further into Native American lineage, Miss S's grandparents, mother and brother, are of the Mi'kmaq tribe, and they're an indigenous group of people also of the northeastern woodlands, native to the areas of Canada's Atlantic provinces. And this trickles all the way down to Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, which we talked about, and into Maine. So they are of Native American heritage. So it would make sense that these Pukwudgies were very interactive with their family. And I ran across this other story, again, anonymous source. So we have to take this, with a grain of salt to some extent, but at the same time say, hey, it's very interesting. Let's listen to it and see what they have to say. So this lady says when her sister and she were young, I find it always interesting that these types of creatures mess around with children a lot. Children see them a lot and interact with them. So she says when her sister and her were young, they saw one of these creatures in their bedroom, and they shared a bunk bed and a trailer as kids. And the lady telling the story said that she slept on the bottom and her sister was on the top. And she said that she was 4 or 5, her sister was 7. And so she said late one night, they were getting ready to fall asleep and they saw something moving out of the corner of their eyes. It was a 3 foot tall, slightly glowing, grayish, blue goblin / troll looking figure entered into the bedroom. Found it interesting. Gray skin, glowing, bluish. Again, nighttime in a bedroom. What are these creatures? What are these 3 foot creatures rolling around that look like modern grays in some format? And they said it moved slowly as if it was just wandering. It had an elongated nose, fingers, ears, feet, and long hedgehog-type hair down its back. So that's the thing that differentiates it from the typical grays. It's got this hedgehog, almost like mohawk, that goes all the way down its back. Long, skinny torso, but fit and lean with muscle. The entity was wearing a Native American type outfit as far as the cloth over its body. So the entity walked into the middle of the room, stopped, and looked at both of us with a blank stare staring into our eyes. We were both dead quiet. It was weird. She said they didn't feel scared or threatened, but it looked more like it was tired. And they said that it didn't last long. And then the entity looked forward, continued to walk, and just literally walked through the wall, never to be seen again. So the older sister freaks out. Did you see that? And they grab their Nerf guns and they are holding their Nerf guns, trying to protect themselves. And later on in life, when this lady gets to her 20s, she's watching some sort of ghost hunting show. And it was a group of college students. And she said she couldn't remember the name of the show. But they start talking about there's a ghost haunting this particular property. And the ghost is from Native American folklore. It's 2-3 feet tall and gray. And she said, well, wait a minute. And then they said that the entity was a Pukwudgie. And she starts looking on Google for all these images. And she's like, oh my God, this is it. This is what I saw. This grayish looking hedgehog looking thing wearing Native American clothes that walked in. Now, she said a lot of the depictions that she saw online were very scary looking. She said the one she saw didn't have fangs or claws like some of those pictures. But then again, she said it wasn't threatened by us and we weren't threatened by it and just kept moving. So maybe that was something that could have come out of it if it had felt threatened. But I thought that was also an interesting story, a very modern story. And I've heard of plenty of people who have gone into these different wooded areas like the Bridgewater Triangle that have had interactions with these beings, sometimes with these beings or entities, and they are shapeshifted into something else, some sort of animal, and the animal disappears, and then this entity thing pops up. So it lends the idea that this thing can shapeshift into animals as well. But I would really hone into the fact that the Pukwudgie, in my opinion, under this fairy umbrella, is it some sort of hybrid? I would lend to the idea that if we're going to look at it as something physical, or at least coming from something physical, more than likely it comes from some sort of Nephilim bloodline. And if not, it's purely metaphysical from another realm, and it's able to move in and out of our realm. And it's some sort of creature from there. And maybe there are multiple versions of it, just like fairies, where there's so many different ideas of it. Maybe there's things that masquerade as Pukwudgies as well. We don't really know, because we know that Pukwudgies are shapeshifters, just like a lot of these other versions of fairies. So I would put it in this particular category of fairies, this North American tied directly into the Native Americans, this Native American fairy that seems to be more often than not malevolent, trying to hurt people. Definitely something that if you ran across, you need to be careful of. But I thought it would be really fun and interesting to go down this particular rabbit hole before we get outside of it and touch grass and just explore the idea of the Pukwudgie. And to commemorate this episode, I've got the new Pukwudgie shirt that we have now put in the Free the Rabbit shop for anyone to purchase. We've got different colors of the shirt as well. It's super cool. It's just a bunch of Pukwudgies doing all kind of crazy stuff in the woods. And it's a fun shirt. So if people see it and they look at it, what's that? What are those? And you can tell them. And you can get into hybrids and all kind of other cool stuff and maybe lead them down a good path to understand what these things are, what they might come from, and, you know, what our purpose is going forward in the world, and how that the unseen realm is becoming more and more seen as we go. But guys, I had a blast today. This was a fun episode. I've been wanting to talk about Pukwudgies for a while, and I wanted to do a nice little breakdown for you. On the way out, make sure you guys are giving a 5-star review on any platform you're on. Make sure you're giving a 5-star review on Spotify. Make sure you're writing a review plus giving a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. If you're on YouTube, make sure you like, subscribe, hit the notifications, share, and make sure you comment below. That always helps drive the algorithm up on each episode when you actually comment, not just in the live chat, but comment on the episode, whatever that is, right? So I appreciate all the people that have been doing this. On the way out, we're going to play my new song, Impostor. And you know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
I'm in a fun house, locked in a boxcar with all of these clowns. Don't feel like I belong, but maybe I do. Cause when I look in the puddle, maybe I'm just a ruse. Or maybe I'm just confused. Ooh, I'm a gorilla in the jungle, but my mind's got me trapped in the zoo. Ooh, what you see is not what I see. Cause I could be dreams that feel like nightmares, will they end? My reality's more friendly than pretend. And I don't know if my perception's innocent. I'm never satisfied, I'm looking to transcend. Real me gets confused with the clones I create on my own. My palace corridors to the lab, it's a throne. Pyramids of deception above the halls of a minty. If I leave, will I even miss me? Yeah. Face to face with my ambition, yeah. My position with me, I'm in competition, yeah. I could be superstitious, cause it feels like it's a sickness. What you